However, if you look carefully at what the clearinghouse products are now, it looks as if, depending on the particular education area, I've got a 0 in there. It should be, it should be a plus. At best, 10% of the trials show that something works. Right? Forget about that. That's a bit. So roughly speaking, the other 80 to 90% of the time, you're in an arena in which there are negative effects or no detectable effects, based on decent trials. And as I said, the failure to produce evidence at all is high in a lot of sectors. Hence, we justify our existence by trying to set up scenarios in which we get better evidence. On the issue of, third question, how do you design these interventions so as to reduce the likelihood that you're going to fail to reach expectations? As I said, as a statistician, it's just not my job. But these failures occur often enough, so I feel compelled to try to anticipate, especially for new trialists, people doing experiments in new areas, what will happen. Al Rees, eminent criminologist in this country, it's now deceased, but globally, always had the view, including in the earliest trials, so the spouse assault replication program trials that NIJ funded. Basically, if the new program looks a lot like the old program, don't bother to experiment. You're wasting your time. If it looks a whole lot different from the old program, then maybe you can take a shot and maybe something will happen. But in many cases, certainly in economic experiments, we're often tinkering at the margin here between, say, a 5% increase or a 5% marginal tax rate or a 6% marginal tax rate. It's just not worth experimenting on to find out what the effects are on employment or in revenue generation and so on. Now, if you pick up any of these books on why the bridge fell down, you'll find a lot of talk in engineering jargon about, quote, safety factors. And these are basically factors of ignorance. If I design a bridge, I don't want some kid to come along with a baseball bat, smack it, and have the bridge come down. I want to design it so that the structure holds up under a variety of loads, including loads that I can't even anticipate now, loads that are unknowable, unpredictable, and so on. So I multiply everything by 5 to beef it up. There are some bridges out there built in at the turn of the century, last century, that still hold up well based on these enormous safety factors that engineers used to use. Maybe we ought to be using ideas or themes like that in the social sector to design interventions better, to anticipate the unknown, the uncertainties out there. I have colleagues who are involved often on the financial legal side in the idea of due diligence, understanding how to construct checklist approaches. Due diligence is checklist to assure that all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed, things are in place well before the experiment. This is tough to do, but seems like a noble aspiration. It's certainly the case that in other disciplines, in a variety of sectors, this has been helpful, despite the fact that the idea of a checklist sounds so pedestrian. Atul Gawande, who writes for the New Yorker magazine, he's a physician, has a marvelous little book out entitled The Checklist Manifesto, in which he looks at the idea of using checklists across different disciplines, FAA, engineering, medicine, and the like. If your hospital or a surgical team is not used to using checklists, I'd sure go to find another surgeon, because the risks are pretty high that somebody's going to forget something without those checklists. It's a team-oriented approach, but the physical checklist is the important item. There are other ways of thinking about this. SWOT, at least in some of the business sectors and some of the defense sectors, trying to understand beforehand and plan for, in developing an intervention, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats presented out there. Seems like one way to introduce order into the usual chaos. May not be the right brand or the right variety, but it's sort of worth thinking about. Let me get on with this, because what about the trial design? Certainly, with respect to designing trials that help us learn from failure, there's been a lot of progress over the last decade and a half. We do far fewer black box controlled trials in which we just test the thing, look at the difference in the outcome variables, and then declare something effective. Rather, now we're taking a lot more time to understand that the black box is in place, what's inside the black box. There's lots of emphasis on implementation measures, incentive systems that keep the thing driven, troubleshooting teams, and so on. However, there's still lots of room for improvement in the sense of designing controlled trials so that we anticipate ignorance, especially in new areas. The idea here basically is to, get two cohorts of people involved in a trial, one in year one, one in year two. Figure that year one is going to be in a run-in period, a period in which you make all the mistakes you can possibly make ahead of time. Kiss those data off because it's going to be worthless for analysis purposes, but you're going to learn a lot about doing the thing right the second time around. This has not been a strategy that's been unrecognized. Indeed, Larry Sherman did it in the first one of the first trials outside of Minneapolis on police arrest for misdemeanor domestic violence crimes. I can't quite remember which city he was in. Wasn't Minneapolis? Well, anyway. But treat this as the early stages as training wheels. Among others, the W&T Grant Foundation has taken this seriously, recognizing that you can't always anticipate what the problems are in the trials. So the foundation folks, Bob Granger, the president, and his colleagues, have taken seriously the idea that there ought to be mid-course corrections or observations from a foundation's point of view based on this. The foundations, he believes, should take high risks. But along with the high risk, you've got to figure out how to identify the risks when the flops occur and so on and so forth. And one way to do this is to exploit things like two cohort designs in order to reduce the likelihood of subsequent of things going belly up badly later. Ex post facto analyses. All right, this is where things get really tough. We in the social sciences can't test a failure. Engineers can test pieces of concrete, crush them, find out what the crush point is, and make decisions about building things, building interventions based on those failure tests. We can't do that, or at least our IRBs won't let us do that. So we can't exploit that kind of perspective or theme to make progress. What we can do is go through another basic checklist. It says ex post facto. Was the control trial designed and executed well? If it wasn't, then kiss off any answers to any of the subsequent questions. Were the interventions delivered as advertised? And then what about the theory of theory underlying the new program? Was that wrong? Items A and B are relatively sort of easy because the state of the art in making judgments about the quality and design and execution of these trials is pretty advanced. NIJ's folks can do it. The WhatWorks Clearinghouse is up to its ears in this. The Campbell collaboration, the Cochrane collaboration, other outfits have been developing the state of the art. The second piece, there are reasonable standards for determining whether the interventions were delivered as expected or as advertised or available. They're not always uniform or transparent, as we learned over the last couple of days. What does that say? I'm sorry, David's giving me a message here.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, all right. Thank you. I can't read your writing. People don't talk loud enough and they don't make this print big enough anymore and so on. Okay, ex post facto, item C. This is, it gets to be a little bit more interesting. Rather than finger pointing and blame laying and all the rest of this business, how do we think about this? It seems, at least for some of us, that the local theory about why the thing failed, why the thing went belly up, why we didn't get any effects is absolutely essential. For example, a while back there were some re-entry controlled trials being done, and nothing seemed to be workforce re-entry trials, and nothing seemed to be working, at least on paper, numerically, the analyses were being done by an external outfit which was not privy to local knowledge. Turned out to be the case that the excuse me, training programs, manpower training programs on labor force reentry were in an environment in which the program might well have worked had there not been a local recession and nobody was getting jobs, right? The ceiling effect on the extent to which you could have any effect at all. Now, that's a simple-minded example, but this sort of scenario invites us to think about logic models or theory or analytic path models in the sociological jargon that illustrate, portray how things should work, lots of arrows. What we often lack is logic models for figuring out after the fact why the thing did not work. All right? The data are often limited. All of it's correlational, so any analyses ex post facto are going to have to be speculative. My argument is that it's in our interest to build a knowledge base in this area. This is the last slide. Basically, what mechanisms are out there to help do this? None are doing it. I must tell my Microsoft story has to do with giving an invited presentation at Microsoft Asia, which has its big office in Beijing. About 80 to 100 people there, all PhDs, computer science, mathematics, and so on and so forth. My shtick was telling them about organizations like the Campbell Collaboration, which had to take the enormous amounts of information they might produce, they might make available, and do something to make it manageable, to assure that it was dependable. For example, if you do a Google search on, quote, what works, as I did a while back, you can get easily 6 million hits in 0.05 seconds. Working through that is hard. Now, it turned out that I found out from my Microsoft colleagues at that lecture that their aspiration for them, the idea of quality of the evidence was irrelevant. Their aspiration lay in boosting that number from 6 million to 30 million and cutting the time down from 0.05 seconds to 0.005 seconds. There's no opportunity to do any further communication on this. It was a revelation. However, there are entities that are well positioned in some sense to think a little bit more seriously about inventing a subdiscipline called failure analysis that might be productive. Cochrane, Campbell, this outfit. Actually, where's Cynthia's matrix, evidence-based crime matrix, actually invites this. It's an interesting portrayal, in effect, of this idea. So, but it's going to take a little bit of work and a little bit of audacity and certainly a little imagination, because it's not being done in an orderly way. And so there's lots of promise out there.